Pamirs community of Gorno-Badakhshan region and on social religious development of Pamiri population following the collapse of the Soviet Union. So Zemira, the floor is yours, and thank you very, very much for being with us today.
Well, Sebastian and the organizers, thank you very much for having us on this panel. I also would like to thank Sirojudin and Suzanne for setting up the scene for my further discussions. Those really enabled to kind of delve a little bit further to discuss the community itself. So I think to build on what you already mentioned is that when thinking about the Tajik Pamiri communities, predominantly resident in Gorno-Badakhshan and even beyond, it's really important that we debunk a few myths, Susan, as you've mentioned, created in the last couple of months, and particularly in the controlled media, yes, Jadine, and which is dominant, one of the dominant sources of information today. So the first myth is really about the justification for conduct or the need for anti-terrorist operations in the region, and related accusations of links with the Taliban of Afghanistan, with the aim to destabilize socially and politically the country and the region. So that's the first myth. The second myth would really relate to the idea that the Tajik Pamiris engage in violent actions, and many have political ambitions, as opposed to their exercising their civil or human rights within the legal framework of Tajikistan. The third myth, I would say, is that Tajik Pamiris do not see themselves as part of the Tajik nation. I think this is another wrong assumption, and really have been played into fueling the practices we see today. So the spread of such disinformation, in my view, is indeed damaging, and to anyone with limited knowledge of the region or who hears or reads about the recent events involving targeted, often unsanctioned practices against the community, such as mentioned by my colleagues, may be seen or perceived as justifiable. And I think this is a danger. The alternative local narrative is largely suppressed, and the huge lack of research, unfortunately, on the community and any I mean, Susan, you're one of the few who really have performed studies on the community. Probably Tim Mastanovsky is another one. But this huge lack of research on the community, and particularly after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and any literature around it, hugely impedes the grounded analysis and understanding of the situation on the ground. So to debunk those myths which I've just mentioned, I feel like it's important that we begin by pointing out that anyone who knows well or researched the Tajik Pamiri community recognizes the profound transformations in their sense of identity, including national identity, and how the community came to perceive itself since the breakup of the Soviet Union in early 19th and their subsequent reunion with their global spiritual leader, the Aga Khan, many may know him as such, following 70 years of isolation, Soviet isolation. So there is also this tendency, I think, another dangerous tendency to link current events to the outbreak of the bloody civil war 30 years ago and the involvement of the Tajik Pamiris in the conflict as part of the Tajik United Opposition to the incumbent government. These facts are correct. However, this is a valid link to understand the trend and the actions of the authorities, including their justification for their practices today. However, in my view, when it comes to the understanding of the community's involvement with the events today, as opposed to 30 years ago, it can be a dangerous link. To elaborate, the parameters or lens we use to view those events 30 years ago, the reasons for the involvement of the Tajik Pamiris in the conflict, and the political ambitions they held at the time, although pro-democratic, are no longer applicable or valid frameworks for today's analysis of the events. Some critical developments have happened in the last 30 years, which led to Tajik Pamiris becoming largely apolitical. there has been a significant shift in their perceptions of their identity, including national identity. From as early as the breakup of the civil war, the messages of replacing violence with a dialogue, working with the government, seeing themselves as part of the Tajik nation, and working towards the betterment of wider communities in which they live were the paramount and prevalent messages coming from their spiritual leader, the Aga Khan. And those been internalized deeply by the community. I mean, just a small mention of what it means to be led by the Aga Khan is that Pamirs also happen to be a religious, their faith as a faith community. It's a Shia Ismaili Muslim community, and it is also happens to be a minority community. The Shia Ismailis are the second largest group of Shia Muslims around the world, and Pamiris or Tajik Pamiris, Tajik Ismailis, whichever way you call them, they are part of the global Ismaili community. So the Aga Khan is the spiritual leader, and according to the three principles in Islam, the third particularly the imamat, after the Tawheed, the notion of the oneness of God, which is the first you are shared with all Muslims, the notion of Tawheed, the oneness of God, the notion of Nubuwah, the prophethood, and the third, which is shared with the other Shia Muslims, is the imama, or the guidance of the imam, and the Aga Khan is the imam. So the following of the imam and his guidance is the profound kind of it's a doctrine for the Ismaili Muslims to do that, to follow that. So whatever messages are coming from the Aga Khan are engaged with dearly and internalized, and there's been a consistent messaging such as this from the imam, not only to the community in Tajikistan but globally. And even in the recent events, I mean, there's been a talika, the guidance from the imam again, reminding people to stay calm, to not resort to violent actions, and work within the government. I mean, those messages are also, there on the ismaili.org website, so those could be even analyzed. But so this is kind of what I'm trying to get to. There's been these profound transformations in how Ismailis view, Tajik Pamiris Ismailis view themselves today, and it's fascinating development when we clearly see the community's perceptions of their identity entailing the appreciation of the ethnic, religious diversity and uniqueness of all peoples in Tajikistan. And Pamiris seeing themselves as community explicitly being part of the Tajik nation. It probably hasn't been at all the case, or partially the case, before the outbreak of the civil war. I mean, it was a mutual thing among Tajik Pamiris or other Tajiks. So, but today they talk about the necessity for them as Tajik Pamiris and Ismailis to live in peace and abide by the laws of the country. So the peaceful protests, which we saw in November and recently, are really placed within this framework of abiding by and respecting the state laws. And if we see the footages from the recent events, I mean, from the mobiles taken by the locals from November and recently, there is no involvement of arms or any external forces. So I think it's really important that we start, or those who may not be that aware of the region and the events, we understand these critical developments within the community itself and their perceptions of what it means to be Tajik Pamiris in Tajikistan today, not 30 years ago. Okay, so Sebastian, please, over to you.
Thank you so much, Zamira. So, well, we have, I mean, of course, I mean, this raises